Yes, I think we're all seated. Hi, everybody. Welcome. It's good to see you all, and a special welcome to our three guests, the distinguished experts on the first row here. Karolina Hird, Jaroslava Barbieri, and Illia Riepin. Welcome to Norway and this seminar. I am Kjell Bjerga, Director of the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies, the IFS, at the Norwegian Defense University College. It is a great pleasure for me to stand here and welcome you all to this timely and important event. In fact, this event has two purposes. First, it is a launch of our new research initiative, the program on Ukraine and full spectrum threats. That is a research program in support of Ukraine, funded by the Ministry of Defense, and building on a strong Ukraine legacy at the Norwegian Defense University College. The full spectrum program we are launching today is led by Karen Anna Eggen at the IFS, and her team is already well underway with planning, research activities, and strengthening the collaboration we have with close Ukrainian partners. This seminar is the program's first public event. In a time of influence operations and disinformation campaigns, also here in Norway, credible research on Russia's illegal war against Ukraine is more important than ever, 11 years after Russia started this war in 2014. On that note, please join me in a round of applause in support of Ukraine and for the program, and of course the brave Ukrainian people still fighting in Ukraine. So, second, the seminar we are gathered for today. It is a joint event with the IFS and UKRAINETT, as you can see on the slide behind me. It will be chaired by Håvard Bækken from the IFS. He is a senior researcher specialized in Russian politics and society. And Håvard, you will introduce our guests and speakers thoroughly afterwards. The purpose of the seminar is to take a closer look at Russia's occupation policies and its efforts to consolidate control over Ukrainian territories. This is very important to understand Russia's war against Ukraine. However, this aspect of the war is often under-communicated by the media, and it spans a wide spectrum, from administrative measures to large-scale nationalization and Russification projects, forced deportations and killings. Our seminar will address different dimensions of Russia's occupation policies and their consequences from the evolution of Russia's control regime in occupied territories to Russia's deportation of Ukrainian children and how Ukrainians are resisting the occupation behind enemy lines, like we did for 5 years here in Norway during the Nazi occupation. Håvard Bækken will lead us through the discussions, and I think without further ado, Håvard Bækken, please.
Thank you, Kjell Inge. We should have had this, planned this in advance, so I don't need to repeat you. So I just want first to thank UKRAINETT again, because they have been hosting us 3 times now, talking about the Russian occupation regime with Ukrainian guests. It has been a very important platform for us. And of course now with a new platform through the research program on Ukraine and full spectrum threats, we have now 2 strong institutions that can work together in promoting these kinds of events. And I think and hope that our new research program can be used exactly for this purpose, to invite foreign guests to Norway to add some expertise on this, on topics that we don't really have enough expertise on already in the country, because we're a small country. We need some voices from outside. We have 2 kind of a mini-series of 2 or 3 events these 2 days. So there will be a closed seminar tomorrow. Some of you have been invited, I know, where we will delve in more detail on select topics about occupation regimes. Today we will have 3 presenters, each having an introduction at 20 minutes. So first 2 introductions, we'll have a short coffee break, then a 3rd presentation, and we will have time for conversation and Q&A after. So if you have questions, I'm sure you do, then just be patient, take a note, and you will get time towards the end. We have set aside 40 minutes, so I really hope we get time for your questions this time. Okay, so my original suggestion for a title was actually Understanding Russia's Occupational Regimes. But okay, or policies. But there's a reason because I wanted to have the plural form here. Because it's very important to understand that Russian occupation has not been one unitary process, not one unitary strategy, one set of policy. It's a set of policies, different strategies in different regions. So Crimea cannot be equated with the Donbass before 2022. And none of them can be equated with what is going on now. So Russia has a very different set of strategies and policies and approaches. And I think the perfect person to give us an introduction to that will be Jaroslava Barbieri. She just completed her PhD at the University of Birmingham on the evolution as well and of Russian policies towards the Donbass and Transnistria. But she has also been following the situation close with regard to the more recently occupied territories. So I'll give the floor to you, Jaroslava, on the evolution of Russian occupation policies.
So thank you very much for coming today, and thank you very much to IFS and UKRAINETT for organizing this. We were just speaking earlier today how important it is to keep the discussion around the evolution of what has been going on in the occupied territories so far and the future of these territories and the people residing in them on the agenda. So as Håvard has mentioned, I've spent the past 5 years to study the evolution of Russia's occupation policies in eastern Ukraine. And the reason why I've wanted to do this, I'll just mention in a second, is that I believe there's been a big gap in the debate over the period 2014 and 2021 in which we haven't paid sufficient close attention to this topic. And I would go as far as to say that the lack of attention on what Russia has been doing there over that period in the pre-2022 period is partially the reason why we did not see the potential escalatory scenario of a full-scale invasion becoming conceivable in the eyes of the Kremlin. So on this slide, I put a screenshot of excellent studies that have appeared in the debate, focusing on different aspects of Russia's occupation policies in southeastern Ukraine and Crimea. And what they all have in common is the fact that they were published after 2022. And so that leads me to the broader point I wanted to make, is that when you look at the debate in the 2014-2021 period, you see that the vast attention was focused on the humanitarian angle. That, of course, is of vital importance. However, that has distracted us from looking at the actual policies that Russia was putting into place and the messiness of the reality on the ground. And of course, as Håvard said, we cannot really equate on the same level the situation as it had been developing in Crimea, which Russia illegally annexed in 2014, versus the situation in eastern Ukraine, where, as you'll recall, in the 2014-2021 period, there was the Minsk agreements overarching framework that was shaping the debate. A bit later in this pre-2022 period, you started seeing also studies that tried to conduct surveys with people still living in the occupied territories or that had survived occupation, to try and get a glimpse into the day-to-day experiences of people. If, like me, you wanted to address that gap in that debate and try to map out all of these Russia occupation policies in the pre-2022 period, then of course you'd have to spend a lot of time, unfortunately, looking at Russia's state-aligned media platforms, social media platforms, and all of these platforms associated with the occupying administration, because something that was shocking is the amount of information and data that they were being very, very public about. But in terms of independent sources, of course, there was a number of Ukrainian human rights organizations that, beyond that human rights monitoring work, they started trying to capture in different reports glimpses of these occupation policies on the ground. And I think it's very important to sort of retrieve all of that precious information. You also had a number of Ukrainian media platforms, very often had this regional focus, either on Crimea or Donbass. Journalists that originally came from the region and, for example, then joined the Ukrainian delegation, part of the trilateral contact group in the Minsk peace process. And so I think it was very important to try and tap into that existing information, because, again, it was very scattered. And sort of I made it my task in the PhD to try and map out all of the available information out there. And it's also worth saying that there were some English-speaking platforms, as well as Russian investigations, that very often tried to focus on who's who in the region in terms of which were the people that the Kremlin had put in place to manage the day-to-day governance institution in the occupying administration, as well as economic investigation of how Russia was trying to pour money into these regions in the pre-2022 period. So what I wanted to say, essentially, there was data out there, but it hadn't been systematized. And so ultimately, this might seem like a self-evident truth right now, but occupation is a process. And so there are different people that now try to really bring to light the reality on the ground of what Russia has been doing, and of course highlight the differences between territories that have been occupied since 2014 versus territories that have been occupied since 2022. And around 2014, the first years of the invasion, there was all of this attempt to try and figure out how come that Russia decided to escalate its behavior. What were the events that had led to 2014? And of course, now we're in a very different geopolitical scenario in which occupation is becoming more and more this consistent framework for us to make sense of Russia's behavior and activities. But in between, I think there was really a missed opportunities for us to try and understand that all of these policies that we're now drawing attention to and debating, they did not happen in a vacuum. There were these foundations of Russia's presence and its military and political footprint that I think are really worth bringing to light. So let me sort of, in a nutshell, 5 or 10 minutes, try to summarize my work of the past 5 years. So in a nutshell, if we are trying to understand the changing nature of Russia's policies, especially in eastern Ukraine, that's what I had focused on. Before 2022, as I mentioned, there was this Minsk agreements framework, and what Russia had tried to do is replicate a little bit something they had tried to do in Transnistria, which is this region in eastern Moldova with a Russian military presence. And essentially, they, of course, internationally try to push this incredibly harmful narrative of a civil war that I would argue has delayed our attempts to understand what was happening on the ground. And they essentially, if you got your hands dirty to collect all of this data around their policies on the ground, you could see that effectively they were gradually integrating these regions into the Russian federal system, but it was an incredibly messy local situation, because at the level of international negotiations, they were still trying to push that scenario in which they could strengthen these self-proclaimed republics, as they called it, just enough to strengthen the fake demand for autonomy and reintegrate them back into Ukraine under conditions of large autonomy that essentially would have paralyzed Ukrainian state institutions, could have profoundly destabilized Ukrainian society and effectively stopped its Euro-Atlantic integration. And that essentially, at the time, was perceived as this low-cost, relatively low-risk strategy that really played into a well-established Russian Kremlin playbook in that period. When we look at how these foundational policies then have evolved in the pre-2022 period, we see that, of course, the strategy has become way more violent, way more unambiguous about destroying the Ukrainian state and the Ukrainian nation as such. And so I think that it's very important to understand this distinctive framework to basically map out these policies, because it's also important to make sense, because as I mentioned, it was a very complex reality on the ground. So I've tried to organize all of the empirics of the pre-2022 period and post-2022 period around these 4 policy domains. So the political legal, essentially, to understand it, we start with the discursive narratives, because as I mentioned, in the pre-2022 period, the Russian diplomats continued to push this narrative that ultimately these regions would have to be reintegrated into Ukraine, we're just a mediator. But of course, on the ground, they actually continued to push the narrative that future accession to the Russian Federation was an irreversible course. So that narrative had existed since 2014. And they flirted with some concepts such as Novorossiya that then they've resuscitated in 2022. Of course, this domain concerns very practically all of the administration, de facto governance institution they put into place as part of the occupying forces. And so it's very interesting also to look at, for example, the so-called legislation that they introduced after the sham referenda of 2014, in which, if you look at the text of their so-called constitutions, it's literally copy-paste from the 1993 Russian constitution. And when you look at the people that had been put into place in the very early stages, those were Russian citizens. And when you look at some of the interviews that then they gave, they themselves admit how ludicrous it was that the Minsk agreements process was in full swing and all of the de facto leaders were Russian citizens. And so that weakened basically the narrative that Russia was trying to push, that this is a kind of homegrown insurgency and that Russia is just a mediator. So they replaced them with locals to try and do this exercise in political optics. And of course, this process was again reversed when Russia completely changed its strategy in 2022, placing Russian citizens that sort of had experience in managing a kind of federal bureaucracy once the annexation sort of was formalized. And then this is also the domain which I place all the passportization processes that in Eastern Ukraine started properly around 2019, when they gradually started simplifying the process for getting Russian citizenship in place. But actually from the very beginning, you could see coercive mechanism essentially forcing the local population of getting citizenship in exchange for access to basic social services, for medicines. And of course, in the post-2022 period, this has become a radically coercive mechanism in which people have been threatened even with losing parental rights if they don't get citizenship, etc. So as I mentioned, you see the radicalization of many processes that had been in place already in the pre-2022 period. Moving on to the economic financial domains, it's important to understand that in these early stages of the occupation, there was an attempt to simply make these statelets viable, and so they resorted to cryptocurrency in an attempt to just pour money into these regions that internationally were, of course, isolated because of sanctions. And also a very important turning point was in 2017, when Ukraine sort of imposed a economic blockade. And so at the time, there was a very sensitive debate in Ukraine. There was the anti-terrorist operation, it was called back then. And so it was this debate that any form of illicit informal trade could have been extremely harmful, because any money poured into these regions could then be used to fund military activities that were killing Ukrainians. And so that was the decision, and Russia exploited this to push more systematic processes of political and economic integration with the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, and the way they were selling it also to domestic audiences. They sort of established, for example, this Russia Donbass Integration Committee, putting in place a member of the United Russia Party, a member of the Russian community in Crimea. And so essentially this is also a turning point in which you start seeing slowly more systematic attempts to integrate these regions into the Russian federal system. And so also a roundabout way that they try to find to fund these regions is the establishment of a international settlements bank in South Ossetia, which, as you know, is an occupied region in Georgia by Russia. And so at the time, of course, Russia had not recognized the independence of the DNR-LNR, but South Ossetia had back in 2014. And so they used this backdoor mechanism to try and pull more money into the so-called republics. So you see that they try to be creative and try to sort of navigate that discursive space in which they try again to push that scenario under Minsk agreements that sort of they had not abandoned, I would say, at least until early 2021. And then we're moving on to the third domain that is something I hold very dear, and I think I spend most time focusing on this. And this, of course, includes all policies that had focused on indoctrinating and militarizing children and young people in the occupied territories. And so when you look at the occupation policies, these can be summarized under the umbrella of what Russia calls patriotic education, patrioticzkie воспитание. As we have different strands, you have the strand that focuses more on history, so that concerns how history teaching has been completely overhauled in the occupied territories with, you know, the shipping across the border of Russian and new textbooks that were specifically written for the occupied territories, in which, of course, the goal was to portray the history of the region as inextricably linked to Russia. Ukraine was portrayed as an aggressor state, and so the future civilizational choice of Russia was portrayed as a fait accompli, as an irreversible path. And this also concerns compulsory civics classes, so where children are forced to sit in a classroom and exposed to state symbols of the so-called republics, of the Russian state. And so very early on, I would say that these are the policies that Russia had implemented most systematically since the very beginning. And you see very gradually an expansion on any references to Ukraine. And of course, in the 2022 period, these textbooks have been updated to sort of cover what Russia calls the special military operation. But the ultimate goal is to indoctrinate children into hating Ukraine, into imagining only a future as part of Russia. And the harm that these policies are doing will really have long-lasting traumatic consequences, not just for the individuals that have been affected by these, but for Ukrainian society at large. And moving on to the final domain, of course, you had also a set of policies that involved, you know, stuff like lessons in courage. So you have representatives of local law enforcement, the military, that were coming into schools and trying to emphasize the prestige of careers in law enforcement and military for local children and teenagers, and then essentially setting up informal recruitment and training mechanisms to get more and more people to get military training, first aid training, and then you have the involvement of open openly paramilitary movements, such as UNARMIA, that have been essentially tasked to recruit children, and that would, for example, join the Russian armed forces. And more recently, sort of they kept sort of developing this aspect, and you have, for example, the movement of FIRST, that essentially is just a resuscitation of the young pioneers of Soviet times. So this is really a field in which they really have been consistent from the very beginning. And then they started sort of creating military school, cadet schools that sort of were meant to strengthen Russia's military footprint in the regions. And the last thing I want to say about this domain is that I think it was immediately before the first Normandy format summit, which, as I recall, is the format that gathered Germany, France, Ukraine and Russia in the pre-22 period. And what was interesting is that the de facto leader of the DNR back then published a piece of legislation that essentially had declared that back then the borders of the DNR were coinciding with the borders of the former Ukrainian Donetsk region. So back then already there was, in 2019, a promise of this more revanchist agenda against Ukraine. So, how am I doing with time? So I will not spend too much time talking about this. Maybe this is something that we can discuss as part of the Q&A discussion, but I think that something that is very important is to think about the future of these regions and really think about what will happen, what are the implications, you know, even using this kind of framework of different policies domains, what will happen, what will be the long-term implications for Ukraine's future security and recovery if Russia were to maintain control over these regions, and what will be the more long-term ramifications for the rest of Europe. And so I won't get into the kind of details of how I think this might go, but something that I want to leave you with is that the kind of transactionalist approach that we've seen from the US administration, the very tragic irony is that they're really replicating the mistake that had been done under the Minsk agreements in the pre-2022 period, which is to force Ukraine to make political, territorial concessions under the expectations that that will sort of appease Russia and sort of satisfy its aggressive policies. We've seen what this has led to. And then, at the same time as continuing to monitoring what Russia has been doing in the occupied territory, it's also very important to continue monitoring how Russia's domestic discourse is developing, because it's allowing us to get a glimpse into any shifts in the Kremlin's overarching political strategies. And even like a bit over a month ago, there was a sort of forum in Rostov-on-Don where essentially, again, there was this whole a narrative in which the annexation of these regions was presented as a fait accompli. So let's talk about we can further integrate them. Of course, creates very lucrative investment opportunities for people with close ties to the Kremlin. So I will just leave you with the idea that if there's something that Ukraine has taught us, Ukrainians have taught us, is how to be inventive and how to be brave. And as we are entering all of these discussions about, you know, how Europe has to bolster its defensive because we're possibly entering a new era in which the US security umbrella might no longer be there, we really need to pull ourselves together and get this act of political imagination and moral courage. And so I'm really hoping that events like this can sort of bring together for people that care about this and sort of how we'll navigate this very uncertain future. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Also, thanks for a perfect bridge segue onto the next speaker talking about brave Ukrainians. We have invited Illia Riepin. He is a political scientist, an author and columnist. We invited him to Oslo first and foremost because he has this joint project with Jade McGlynn, who cannot come in person. On collecting and analyzing and not least reporting on resistance in the occupied territories of Ukraine, which is also a very important topic to keep in the back of our minds at all times, to not forget that Ukrainians are still fighting. So we're very pleased to have you here, Illia. Please come on stage.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you once more for invitation. Honestly, it's a big glory to be here as a Ukrainian, especially as a Ukrainian who talks about Ukrainians and especially about Ukrainians who right now behind the enemy lines. So yeah, my topic is Ukrainian resistance in temporarily occupied territories. My name is Illia Riepin. I'm a research and assistant of Dr. Jade McGlynn. We work we focus on the dynamics and the strategies of the Ukrainian resistance in temporarily occupied territories, as well as the resulting effect of their actions. And right now, please look to this slide. It's a map of Ukraine, the modern map of Ukraine, recently updated. You could see the red regions, the regions that colored in red. Right now, it's what when we're talking about occupied Ukraine. It's all of these parts right now is under occupation. Let's talk in numbers. About 20% of modern Ukraine territories right now is under occupation. It includes, of course, about 6 million people, and 1.5 million of this is children. I guess Karolina will talk more about it later. When we talk about modern occupation, we talk about, of course, Crimea, that right now under annexation from 2014. We talk about parts of Kherson region, part of Donetsk region, Luhansk region, and part of Zaporizhia region with Melitopol and Berdyansk in it. So yeah, this is the short chronology of occupation. I guess already Jaroslava made focus on it, but my points here that when we talk about occupation, and especially when we call it temporarily, we also need every time to remind that we have liberation in it. It's any goal in occupation, it's liberation. So we also had the waves of liberation already. You could see it was in 2022. We have in April the central Ukraine were liberated. In September, the Kharkiv region were liberated, and 1 month after the Kherson right bank liberated as well. But what happened next? What happened after 2022? Because I guess it's more about 3 years. Yeah, after these liberation waves. So from 2023 to the present, to the 2025, we could say that occupation authorities and the Russian officials shifted to the policy of long-term integration of already occupied territories in their legal framework. By that, I mean that they increased any type of administrative control, right? And they do and did a lot of different attempts to destroy local identity of Ukrainians on this territory. Before talking about Ukrainian resistance, we should understand that there are different type of models of occupation, and it's important to know because resistance acts due to each of the models. For example, we have integrated annexation. Yeah, it was in Crimea in 2014. Like bloodless implementation of Russian law with already done process of passportization, with already done process of mobilization of men in these territories, and of course with the systemic repression of local population. In Crimean context, it means the repression of Crimean Tatars. We have proxy republics. We have DPR, LPR, DNR, LNR, like People's Republic here. It's local puppet governments, but with already developed power structure, military structure, and police structure, with of course with total mobilization of men in these territories. And we have civil military administration. This model, of course, appeared only after full-scale invasion. So, this civil-military administration based on part of Kherson and Zaporizhia regions right now, that occupied parts of Kherson. And we could also find some of this administration in Donetsk and Luhansk region that right now not part of the DNR or LNR. So yeah, here we also find huge acts of Russian officials with filtration camps, with using the FSB agents, and all of these types of replacement local symbols to Russian. For example, yeah, with the currency replacement from hryvnia, Ukrainian hryvnia, to Russian rubles. Yeah, so yeah, as I mentioned before, about 6 million people lived there. 1.5 million from them are children. And in what condition they live right now? In my honest opinion, we can split it in two different conditions. It's information isolation. By that I mean absence of any access to Ukrainian medias, the huge spread of disinformation and restriction to this free internet sources. And of course, they live in fully complete political isolation. By that I mean any absence to any political representation or any mechanism of decision-making on these territories, as well as repression of expression any political view there. So, in this context, in my honest opinion, the activity of resistant groups is a key factor in deterring the Russian colonial policy. But what is resistance? Yeah. In general, it's umbrella term, yeah, right? So when we're talking about resistance, we should understand the set of actions, of different actions that aimed at countering the occupation policies, the occupation power, and the occupation officials. So they can be individuals, they can be groups, so they can be decentralized, or they can be atomized even. They can act openly or underground. They can do both violent and non-violent actions. All of these actions, it's action of resistance. So, yeah, why it's important to talk about resistance? First of all, for me as a Ukrainian, it's important to talk about resistance because visibility means support. So, while we're talking about while we're talking about resistant forces on these territories who are not able to talk right now because they're somewhere else behind the enemy lines doing their job. With this talking, we support them. And thank you once more for organizing this seminar, because it's also contribute them. So, of course, secondly, resistance is a part of national effort. So it's continuous hand of Ukrainian regular army where Ukrainian regular army cannot be right now. So, and finally, as my previous speaker mentioned before, we have a gap. We have this academic gap and media gap in talking about resistance. And as for me, it's important to make you here to understand that the occupation is not a choice. Yeah, and people who are there, they are not agree with Russian policies. And the resistance is a proof of it. That the proof that people who are there still fight and wait the time when they will be liberated. So, yeah, with Dr. Jade McGlynn, we focus more on two types of resistance, violent and non-violent, but yeah, our main focus, our more representative focus is on violent resistance. Let's talk in examples. We have movement Mariupol Sprotiv. in Ukrainian, Sprotiv Mariupol. It acts from 2022. It engaged in different violent actions as arson, sabotage, and even liquidation. And yeah, they located, the case we found located in Mariupol, of course, Donetsk region, and sometimes also we find their evidence of their actions in Russia region. So, example of non-violent resistance. Yeah, movement Yellow Ribbon, Żółta Sтрічка in Ukrainian. It also acts from 2022. The activists there leave yellow ribbons as a symbol of Ukrainian nationality. They leave leaflets or even QR codes with information about resistance. And this acts means that we are here and we are waiting for liberation. Yeah, geographically you can find them mostly in Kherson region, Zaporizhia, sometimes in Crimea, and very irregular, but even in Donetsk and Donbass region. So we could say that it's more like southern region for them. So yeah, let's right now talk about results of my with Jade work, monitoring of resistance forces from December 2024 till the present. Right now we have at least 94 confirmed incidents in the different report session. You could see that we split it on different categories. We have attacks on transport vehicles. Then we have attacks on critical infrastructure, sabotage on transport infrastructure, some assassination attempts, and the category other. The category other exists just because every time we find something new, something that we cannot right now understand. Which category is it? But let's also talk shortly on examples. Attack on transport vehicles, May 16, Melitopol, Zaporizhia region, car bombing of pro-Russian activists, with evidence, of course. Sabotage on transport infrastructure, May 14, Alexievka, Kherson region, explosion at a railway cabinet, with evidence. Attack on critical infrastructure, May 13, Black Sea gas platform. Back in the day, it was Ukrainian gas platforms that right now also occupied by Russians, and the Russians put on some kind of anti-drone systems on these gas platforms, and with the help of Ukrainian resistance, with the help of geolocation of it, the Ukrainian regular army destroyed it successfully like 10 days ago. Yeah, and yeah, assassination attempts. Last we found in 1st of May. It's a small village in the occupied Kherson region. It was an attempt to eliminate a local collaborator. We don't have any evidence of his death, but we have evidence that he is mostly injured in the hospital. So, demographics. Yeah, right now, most of cases were in eastern Ukraine, in Donetsk and Luhansk region. On the second place, we have, of course, southern Ukraine. Yeah, it's Zaporizhia region and Kherson region, as well as Crimea. They have almost the same cases, and of course sometimes we cannot geolocate and to prove that we definitely know where it happened, so we also have the category unknown, but you can see it's not a lot of cases there. But what is interesting in it, that approximately 35% of cases that we found were in Russia. That means that Ukrainian resistance works not only on their native territories, but they also try to sabotage inside of the Russia, and because of the living in occupation and have these roads to Russia, for them it's much more easier to do any kinds of sabotage. And when we're talking about these types of sabotage, I'm talking more about railways sabotage, electronic system sabotage. Yeah, sometimes it's very unusual, but sometimes it's some killing attempts, but mostly of this it's of logistics. Yeah, logistics sabotage. Yeah, the most active months right now, it was April, almost 27% of all confirmed actions we found on April. But you see, we have some restriction in these dynamics. So because we start in lately December and till like May 2022, so we still have time to check what happened after 22 of May. Maybe May will be also very active months. So yeah, let's talk more about activity of different resistance groups. I already mentioned Mariupol Supportive, and honestly, right now, most of the cases we found were did by Mariupol Supportive, or rather, I would say the more confirmed cases were published by Mariupol Supportive, because, yeah, we will talk about limitation of our work later, but yeah. So we also have Atesh, and second place Crimean Partisan and Srok. And who are they? Atesh, acts from 2022. Activists are engaged in arson and sabotage. They located mostly in Crimea, and because they have roads, also open roads to Russia, they also act in Russia. So in Crimean Tatar language, Atesh means fire. I guess it's have some symbolic meaning in it, right? Yeah, so Crimean Partisan movement, yeah, acts also from 2022. The activists also engaged in arson and sabotage, and they right now every evidence we found were only in Crimea. And the Srok, honestly, very young group, at least result of the actions that we found only, I guess I found only like in later March. But right now they did great, or honestly, they did great. The activists are engaged in explosions and the acts, officially the acts from 2023. With all cases that we found were mostly in Zaporizhia and Kherson region, mostly honestly in Zaporizhia, and sometimes even Crimea. So in Russian language, Srok means verdict. So by this action, they make the verdict for Russians. Yeah, the most common method that right now of resistance is arson. 37% of all actions, in some cases, connected with the arsons. So why arson? I guess the answer is very understandable, because it's cheap and fast. Of course, it's very cheap and easy to do it. It's easy to disguise, so you every time can say that it was an accident, it was not me, right? And of course, it has psychological impact, because fire, when you see that something's fire, it's also influence on you and your own understanding of safety when you're, for example, a Russian official. Yeah, so, and at the end of my talk, let's talk shortly about limitations of our study. Yeah, right now, as I mentioned, we have at least 94 confirmed actions of violent resistance, but we think that actual number of it much more higher, because every time you cannot publish everything, right? Especially when you're doing very dangerous work as a force of resistance do. So some of the events sometimes have no clear geographical and temporal reference, which makes the mapping of it much more harder. And of course, we have a limitation sometimes in public verification of it, because all of these confirmed actions were always evident, but sometimes when some group posted the news that they did some new act of resistance, we are waiting the time, and it also needs to wait time when we will find some proofs of it, with the pictures, with the, I don't know, because we are using only open sources methods for it. We don't want to put them in danger position while connecting with them, so we are using only open source. So yeah, public verification sometimes is a real hard problem. And I guess that's all from me. Thank you so much for your attention. Yeah, support Ukraine, support Ukrainian resistance, and yeah, thank you so much.
We have one more introduction. That would be Karolina Hird, all the way from Washington, where she is the deputy leader of the Russia team at the Institute for the Study of War, ISW. So I don't know about you, but if I take my computer and push in on Google the letter U, I immediately get to understandingwar.org, where I've been a million times. It's an incredibly important source for day-to-day reporting on all aspects, or many aspects of the war. Karolina has a special responsibility and interest there in the occupied territories, in particular about the children living in the occupied territories, and also she has been writing and researching and reporting on the deportations of children from the Ukrainian territories and into Russia and what meets them there. So that will be the topic of her introduction. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me today. I'm so excited to be in Norway for the first time ever, representing Washington, D.C. at a really difficult time to be in the Ukraine space in D.C. I am a military analyst by trade, but I found that using a lot of the methodologies that ISW has pioneered is actually really useful in basically assessing and understanding human rights violations in occupied Ukraine. And that has been my focus for the past several years. So we're going to move through a lot of things quite quickly this morning. We're going to start by discussing the Kremlin's objectives in Ukraine and how these objectives help us understand Russia's intentions and policies towards Ukrainian children. We're then going to touch on the key terms and concepts that guide my analysis of this issue, specifically international legal concepts, which are really important in properly contextualizing this. We'll quickly discuss a chronology of open source evidence that builds a picture of how the deportation and adoption of Ukrainian children has evolved since 2022. We will then delve into the various schemes that Russia uses to deport Ukrainian children to Russia, and then close out with a look at forced adoption of Ukrainian children and how that is playing out today. So first and foremost, we need to understand the Kremlin's objectives. Understanding the Kremlin's objectives in Ukraine is critical in understanding its occupation policy and, by extent, its policies towards Ukrainian children in both the context of occupied territories and their deportation to Russia. Putin first invaded Ukraine in 2014 and then, of course, again in 2022 with the intention of dominating the Ukrainian people. Putin firmly believes, as he articulated in his 2021 essay on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, that Ukraine and its people are an inherent part of Russia. This essay and its various ahistorical fallacies is exemplary of the Kremlin's ideology vis-à-vis Ukraine. Russia sees Ukrainians as confused and lost Russians who must forcibly be brought back into the Russian fold. Russia's primary objectives, therefore, are the Russification, so basically forced imposition of Russian identity, and the supplementary destruction of Ukrainian identity in order to destroy the Ukrainian state and its people. These are all nested under the Kremlin's invasion objectives, which were, of course, the quote-unquote denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine, but they're all premised on the idea of the destruction of Ukrainian statehood and sovereignty and identity. Russia's objectives are long-term, and this is why children are at the center of Russia's Russification and identity destruction policies. Targeting children allows Russia to set multi-general conditions for its rule over and subjugation of Ukraine. A few key terms and concepts. You'll notice that I differentiate between deportation and forced removal/transfer. This comes from international law, specifically the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which found that deportation is defined as when an occupying power removes and deports populations outside of de jure international borders. So this is Russia taking Ukrainian children from Ukraine and bringing them to Russia. Forced removal and transfer, slight nuance that's different here, that's the case when an occupying power is moving populations around national borders. So we see this in the context of Russia taking children from Ukraine to camps within occupied Crimea, for example. There's a little bit of a technical nuance there, but the ultimate effect is the same. You can look to the Convention on the Punishment and Prevention of the Crime of Genocide, Article 2, which very clearly states, genocide means any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, including the forcible transfer of children from one group to another group. As we talked about, Russia's objective is to destroy and erase Ukrainian identity, and children are at the core of this strategy, whether it's forced removal or deportation. Here is a pretty brief overline of the way this deportation campaign has evolved since 2022. But I would like to point out that this did not just materialize out of thin air on February 24th, 2022. The deportation of Ukrainian children predates the full-scale invasion. Russia was doing this to some extent in Crimea in 2014. And then actually in the days leading up to the invasion in 2022, it started removing specifically orphans from orphanages in Donbass to Russia under the guise of humanitarian evacuation. So we actually got a report on February 18th that Russia had deported 2,000 orphans from Donetsk and Luhansk to Russia in advance of its launching of the military campaign. There's a few other data points up here that I'd like to draw your attention to. First and foremost, the fact that we started seeing more systematic deportations begin in March 2022 as Russia was besieging Mariupol. Of course, the famous anecdote of this is that Putin's Commissioner on Children's Rights has adopted a teenager from Mariupol who was basically stolen from the city, and now Maria Lvova-Belova has adopted him. Also, interestingly enough, there was a decree that Putin signed on in May 2022 that basically simplified the process for Russian families who wanted to adopt Ukrainian children. It also simplified the process for getting these children Russian citizenship. So you can see that this is very much a Kremlin-directed effort. And then finally, and the most recent data point that I'd like to point out is that as of end of April, so a few weeks ago, Russian Deputy Education Minister announced Russia's plans to remove or deport 53,000 Ukrainian children over the course of the summer. 53,000 children from May to about August or September of this year alone. These numbers are absolutely staggering. So when I talk about deportation and removal, what does this actually mean? Russia is using a variety of schemes to remove children from their homes in occupied Ukraine and deport them to Russia in order to destroy their Ukrainian identities and essentially Russify them. These schemes include summer camps or vacation programs, educational programs, youth civic engagement programs, medical or psychological rehabilitation, military patriotic education and training, and then sociocultural programming. Summer camps is definitely a thing that we've seen intensify in the kind of May to September timeframe every year since 2022. The point of these summer camp programs is, despite the framing that there are these really positive experiences for children to get out of the combat zone and experience rest and relaxation in Russia, we know that the children go there and are exposed to very pro-Russian indoctrination. Their Ukrainian identities are villainized and that sort of thing. So it's not just a harmless summer camp program. It's a very intentional and nefarious way to indoctrinate these children. It's also really unclear if all of these children come back to Ukraine, on what timeline they come back to Ukraine. And Russia's not keeping track of any of this, as it should be. So actually documenting this is very difficult. We also have educational programs, including university exchange programs. A good example of this is the so-called University Shifts program, which by its own announcement intends to deport 2,000 teenagers to Russia this year alone. It received this year 150 million rubles in federal funding, and it basically facilitates basically taking children from age 14 to 17 from Ukraine and putting them in classes in universities throughout Russia. So they're taught about Russian history, Russian culture, that sort of thing. Again, this sort of indoctrination, separation from Ukrainian identity. It also allows these children quicker access to Russian universities, which means that they'll just be stuck in the Russian educational system for most of their lives. We have youth civic engagement programs, such as Movement of the First, which Jaroslava talked about. These are programs that basically, for example, try to teach children about the Russian society and Russian government and that sort of thing. And they hold conferences or congresses in Russia where they bring groups of specifically Ukrainian teenagers to Russia to participate in this, interact with Russian officials. Putin most recently was at the Movement of the First Congress in Moscow a few months ago, speaking to Ukrainian children who were there. One that really scares me is the medical and psychological rehabilitation. We've seen this since the very beginning of the war, Russian officials deporting children under the guise that they need medical help or psychological help from living in a combat zone, which conveniently ignores the fact that Russia created the conditions that are endangering these children in the first place. An example of this is the Klyazma Sanatorium in Moscow Oblast. This is run by the Russian Federal Biological Agency, and it, since 2022, has removed groups of up to 100 children from Rubizhne Luhansk Oblast to this federal sanatorium for treatment, rehabilitation, which ultimately breaks down to indoctrination. We also have military patriotic education and training facilitated through UNARMIA. These are programs that remove children from occupied Ukraine either to training camps in Crimea or deport them to Russia. This is where they learn how to fight for the Russian military, essentially. Learn small arms maneuvers, how to operate drones, all in preparation to serve in the Russian army in 10, 15 years. And then finally, cultural programs, for example, Cultural Map 4+85, which is a recent program I came across. These are programs to basically teach children about, once again, Russian culture, Russian ideologies, and that sort of thing. Cultural Map 4+85, it brands itself as, quote, an effective mechanism for the sociocultural rehabilitation and integration of children into a single Russian society, which I think is a really powerful example of how centralized that indoctrination is. A couple important things to note. These deportation schemes absolutely violate Russia's responsibilities as a belligerent occupying power under international law. This is the case regardless of how long these children stay in Russia, because they are being taken to Russia to be indoctrinated, to be Russified, to basically destroy Ukrainian identity. And that gets into the provisions of the Genocide Convention and also just a lot of moral and ethical problems. But the through line is that Russia is conducting these deportations to Russify Ukrainian children. It is not humanitarian, it is a specific way of erasing Ukrainian identity. And also, Russia's not keeping track of these children. International law requires neutral third-party mediators to be involved, for example, the International Committee of the Red Cross, or for Russia to keep lists of these children and their names and where they're going. They've done none of that. In fact, they've made it really difficult for outside observers like myself to keep track of these children by design. This is a map that is a very small sample set of some of the camps that I came across in the last couple months within occupied Ukraine and Russia, where Ukrainian children will be spending their summers, or who knows how long. The Yale Humanitarian Research Lab, they had confirmed 43 of these re-education camps since, I think, December 2024 was their reporting period. So that this is what I have up here, is just a very small sample set of the 43, and the 43 is also quite a small set. An anecdote that I think is really important is that it's not depicted on this map, but we know that Russia is sending children to a camp in Primorsky Krai, which is in Russia's far east, that is physically closer to the United States of America than it is to Ukraine, which really undermines Russia's idea that this is a humanitarian gesture. If it's humanitarian, why are you taking these children so far from their homes that they're closer to the US than they are to Ukraine? The numbers are staggering. The Ukrainian government has confirmed 19,546 children as of today. The Yale Humanitarian Research Lab was tracking around 35,000 before the Trump administration cut off all its funding and basically closed them down. The real number is likely closer to that 35,000, if not higher. Russia very frequently targets children who are orphans or who do not have guardians who can speak for them for deportation. The Russians actually in 2023 claimed that they accepted, in heavy quotation marks, 700,000 Ukrainian children, which sets the really high benchmark of how far Russia is willing to go to basically take these children from their homes and forcibly integrate them into Russia. So forced adoption is, I think, the most nefarious example of how this is playing out. One of the reasons that Russia is deporting Ukrainian children is to adopt them into Russian families. There was that decree that Putin signed in May of 2022 that simplified this procedure, indicating that it's a Kremlin-directed top-down approach. But it's also been very difficult to track this because we know that these children, as they get adopted, their names are changed from Ukrainian spellings to Russian spellings. Their birth certificates are fabricated, so it's really difficult to track where they're actually from. So it's just a very difficult process of tracking it. Ukraine has to date confirmed about 400 adoptions. The number is likely to be, again, much higher because if Russia comes and takes a group of 20 orphans from an orphanage, not every one of those orphans will have someone who can actually vouch for them or identify them. So up here on the screen, I have a social media advertisement from the ruling United Russia Party from April of 2022. This post is basically advertising orphans from Donbass that are up for adoption in Russian families. United Russia has really taken the helm at basically encouraging these adoption efforts, as you'll see in some of the subsequent slides. We have, on the left, this advertisement from the Krasnodar Krai city administration page. It has been deleted. It was actually deleted about 2 days after I wrote about it for ISW. I'm glad I took a screenshot of it, but it is basically advertising that there are 1,000 orphans from Mariupol who are up for adoption in Russian families. So this was August of 2022. This was years ago that this was already starting. And then on the right, we have a screenshot from a documentary produced by a Russian filmmaker about Russian families' adoptions of Ukrainian orphans. This is an interesting anecdote I came across. This is the Tripoliets family from Moscow Oblast. I have confirmed that in the past 2 years, so between 2022 and 2024, they single-handedly adopted up to 5 children from Donbass. They actually received an award from the United Russia Party for their efforts to adopt these children. And I most recently came across this family in reporting of a Russian Orthodox Church baptism of these children, which very much implicates the Russian Orthodox Church in a lot of these indoctrination efforts. That's a whole nother conversation we can have, but the Russian Orthodox Church is involved in this process as well. And then finally, here we have the Bryansk Oblast Children's Commissioner in the center, standing with a group of orphans from Donetsk and an orphanage or a children's home in Bryansk Oblast. I found this particularly sad because the little girl in the center holding the box, it's her birthday, and she's spending her birthday in a Russian orphanage where she's going to be adopted out to a Russian family and basically indoctrinated and very much forcibly removed from her Ukrainian identity, her Ukrainian home, and basically the Ukrainian nation. All right, so to quickly conclude, this is a very systematic issue. It is Kremlin-directed from the top down, and it is enforced and carried out by Russian officials and occupation officials on even the most local levels of occupied Ukraine's government. Russia's preparing its society and military for a long-term confrontation with the West, right? And it needs Ukraine's population in order to make this happen. It needs to destroy Ukraine as an identity and as a sovereign state in order to be able to continue to threaten the West in the long term. This opens up the conversation about all the children who are being deported and then getting summonses once they turn 17 or 18, and then ending up back on the front line in Ukraine fighting for the Russian military. This is multi-generational, it's systematic, and this needs to be part of any conversation we're having about negotiations. We cannot, as supporters of Ukraine, find ourselves in a situation where we are using these children as a bargaining chip in negotiations. We cannot be exchanging children for land. There's no just peace in Ukraine until these children have been returned. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. You can just take a seat here on stage. Each one of you. I'll sit over here then. So the title of the event was A Conversation. I just want to say that before we start, that this is a real conversation. We have not prepared any questions in advance, so you don't know what we're going to talk about. So I just wanted to spin off what you already talked about. And of course, in a normal conversation as well, I don't want it to be a Q&A directly, but feel free to comment on each other's replies and ask each other questions and so on. But I did take a note of a couple of things that I wanted to kind of elaborate, or ask you to elaborate on. So the first is something that concerns all of your fields, namely the unpleasant appearance of Russia using the already occupied territories of 2014 as bridgeheads for continued warfare, very strongly. You mentioned the mass mobilization of people from the Donbass for manpower, which is really staggering, appalling numbers. And of course, Crimea is frequently used for summer camps. Also, experts is taken in from the Donbass who have experience on indoctrinating Ukrainian children. Of course, Crimea has also been used more directly militarily, as a bridgehead. So I wonder if we can talk a bit on what is the significance of all this. How should we interpret it?
I can get us started, I suppose. I think my direct answer to this question is that Russia has a demographic problem, and it has had a demographic problem since the 1990s. And actually, a lot of what we've been seeing in Ukraine in terms of occupation policies is almost seeming to be an attempt to remedy its demographic problem. Russia sees Ukraine and Ukrainians as part of Russia. So they're trying to absorb them into the Russian Federation and the Russian population, in part to kind of help offset these demographic issues. And there's a lot of implications for that politically, economically, right? Occupied Ukraine, Russia's very clearly exploiting it for economic use by seizing industries in Mariupol or throughout the Donbass, that sort of thing. But also, it's a people thing, because I'm on the military side of things. I've been observing what appeared to be Russian preparations for a long war with NATO very closely, and they need people for that. So they're setting conditions to absorb Ukrainians and occupied Ukraine into Russian military capabilities in the 10 to 15-year window. And that's obviously a really dangerous reality for the world, especially for Europe, as the US is kind of walking away from this whole problem set. So that would be kind of my immediate response to this, would be to look at the demographic side of things. The economic kind of offset for demographic issues, and then of course the military reality.
Yeah, I can only add here that during the different time periods in history of Ukraine, Russia used our regular or irregular armies as a front line, like before they use their own armies. And if you look to the numbers of people lost in Second World War, you can see the big difference, percentage big difference between Russian host and Ukrainian host, and it's also about it that they firstly used our armies than there, and the same was during the Cossacks period, and they recruit Ukrainian Cossacks to defend their first lines before they start using their regular army. So yeah, I can totally agree that the question about the people.
I really need to add here because it's striking how this is actually used as ideological resources now to justify Russian occupation, because they often in Unarmia clubs, for instance, play on the tradition of the Cossacks and the tradition of Ukrainians fighting in the Russian wars as a way to attach the regions as well. So it's really a particular phenomenon.
If I can add something to this demographic issue, I think it's crucial and is at the bottom of many policies that we're seeing in Russia, also inside the country itself, because we've seen, especially since 2022, this turning back the clock on women's rights, etc. You know, the reinstatement of Soviet-era rewards for women that have more than 10 children, and literally this is really mirroring what we've seen in the post-World War II Stalinist era, in which to face these incredible losses, they had to sort of boost population. And of course, on the front line, we see that all of these deportation, indoctrination, militarization of children, that is all part of a much bigger picture that I think we sometimes fail to grasp the implications, but that does not concern only Ukraine, it concerns the whole future of European security. And so as Ukraine starts conversations about its future security, its future recovery, the steps that will need to take in order to strengthen its future war-fighting capacity, its future workforce, in order to, bring the country back from the disastrous consequence that Russia has created. Essentially, Russia is creating all of these obstacles to prevent Ukraine from putting in place early on policies that will allow Ukraine to sort of reboost its future in a way.
And it also points to this very important difference about just annexing a territory and attempting to annex a population, which is much more rare and, frankly, unique in modern history. But I'm thinking that this must be also extremely dangerous and extremely risky from the Russian side. I mean, all the talk about fifth columnists in Russia, and then you choose to not only invite but force in hundreds of thousands, even millions of people who actually basically hate you. So I wonder, do you have any ideas? Clearly, Illia has already been working on this, of the risks and costs for Russia to stretch the front lines, to include so many people fundamentally hostile to the country and to the regime.
I guess the quick answer here is Russians honestly, they didn't realize that once they invade Ukraine, they will see these waves of hate in this. They thought, like official thought, that here in Ukraine there will be pleasant atmosphere for the soldiers. So I guess when you think that it's risky for them, yeah, maybe it's true, but they thought oppositely. They thought that once they invade Ukraine, they will hear these brothers' talks with them. And as we know right now, it did happen.
Well, you mentioned history, but isn't this exactly the same ideas that the Russian Empire had about Poland, for instance? Expanding into Poland and then getting these massive problems for hundreds of years later by having a population within the empire with so much resentment and hatred and potential for protest against Russia.
Yeah, it could be the same, but the problem here is they think that during this war from 2014, they already assimilate Ukrainians to the Russian policies, like not legally, but informally. They think that all this time we were only in contact with Russian media, that, for example, I'm from the East Ukraine, I'm from Mariupol, and yeah, they thought that only fact of existing of the time from Mariupol is enough to assimilate me to Russia. But as we could see right now, I don't need to say any proof of it that the war, the full-scale invasion, is more than 3 years right now, and it's the fact and the proof that the only fact of existing near with some countries is not enough to assimilate them.
I think in a lot of ways this is why children and education has been the center of this effort. In occupied Ukraine, the changing of curricula, the importation of Russian textbooks, the preparation of children for military activities, right? This is corrupting a generation starting at age 4 or 5. And if children are being raised in this environment and children are the ones being deported, this is a vulnerable population that isn't exactly going to take up arms. We know that Russia has had challenges with when they've deported younger men, you know, not even men, but like 16, 17-year-old boys who then try to resist when they're in Russia. But that's not the majority. The majority is young children who are growing up in an environment of extreme indoctrination. And this is, I think that's why children are being targeted, is because they're not going to put up that resistance and they're not going to pose the dangers to the Russian regime that maybe were, you know, have historically been the case.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's a reason why they're trying to target children from kindergarten. And I would say that we can also see the scale of these efforts in the educational sector that they're doing. Also, for example, with the expansion of policies that were originally just for Russia's federal systems, for example, where they're trying to create monetary incentives to encourage Russian teachers from richer urban areas to relocate to poorer provincial areas, and now they've expanded this scheme to the occupied territories to try and move Russian teachers and doctors, by the way, to the occupied territories. So all of these assimilatory policies have like a long-term strategic effort, and that's something that really struck me when I was trying to map out its occupation policy from 2014. In many other domains, they've been quite chaotic. It's sort of, sometimes they've been reactive depending on, for example, how Ukraine would choose to engage with the occupied regions. But in the sphere of indoctrination, militarization of children, teenagers, they've been quite systematic from the very beginning. And there's a reason for that.
And if I can add last words here, I guess what the Karolina does with research of Ukrainian children in occupied territories is very important, because maybe not this year, maybe not next year, but once we will hear from Russia this argument that, look, Ukrainians who are raised in our occupied territories right now going peacefully to our army, they're recruiting so well, look, that means that they're against this evil Ukrainians, so Russian will use this as argument to justify the war. And we need to be prepared for that. We need to, informally, I mean, we right now need to know that in some time we will hear that. And that's why every time it's important to understand that it's also work of propaganda. It's work of every time pressuring on them, because they're kids that have no agency. They cannot decide by themselves yet. They don't know what's black or what is white. And yeah, the more war exists, the more these kids are under this influence of Russian propaganda, and it's, of course, it's disgusting.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to before we move to the audience, talk a little bit more about Ukrainian agency here, and not only lack of agency. What can Ukraine do, and what does it do to kind of push these problems stronger into Russia? I mean, the resistance movement, they have links into Russia. Is that something that we can hope that will eventually spread? I mean, to make deeper problems for Russia as a whole?
We're expecting that, of course. Yeah, and I already, I guess, showed some results that Ukrainian resistance works not only on Ukrainian territory, and they sabotage in Russian territory as well. And moreover, right now we also see like a small trend of increasing Russian-based guerrillas in Russian territories that also supports Ukraine and Ukrainian partisans. So yeah, one of the key trends right now is that the resistance increase not only occupied parts, but only inside Russia.
I think, so speaking of Ukrainian agency, I think my response is going to be to highlight the work of some phenomenal Ukrainian organizations who are involved in investigation and repatriation of Ukrainian children. Save Ukraine is a nonprofit initiative of former Ukrainian Children's Commissioner Mykola Kolyeba, and they single-handedly have repatriated, I think, upwards of 600,000 children. Sorry, I keep getting mixed up with my numbers. 600 children, which in the scheme of things, when we're looking at numbers between 20 to 30,000, it's a small portion. But the fact that one organization has been solely responsible for that is incredible. They have networks within Russia, and it's very proprietary, but they're doing a lot of phenomenal work to basically contact children in Russia, begin the process of indoctrination, and then figure out how to bring them home and then rehabilitate them once they're home. Because these children have experienced extraordinary trauma. Personal trauma, the conditions that they face in Russia can often be quite abusive, but then also ideological trauma. So there are, fantastic Ukrainian organizations who are doing a lot to physically save these children and then work with these children once they're back to basically help them recover from the experiences they've had. So I'd really highlight organizations such as Save Ukraine in efforts to exercise and leverage Ukrainian agency.
In terms of Ukrainian agency, I think there's also an additional factor that is important to highlight, both in the Ukrainian domestic context and internationally. But since 2022, we've had also more active, systematic conversation inside Ukraine, for example, around cognitive deoccupation. So the acknowledgement that liberation, reconciliation will be an exceptionally complex and intricate and delicate process, precisely because we know that Russia tries to target generations as they are children, to make this process of eradicating Ukrainian identity irreversible. So it's very promising that these conversations are happening in Ukraine again. I feel they tend to be primarily focused on Crimea, but we're seeing also the expansion of this conversation also to involve Eastern Ukraine. And internationally also, it's quite exceptional to see the difference, because we talk now about different stages of Russia's invasion occupation. There was 2014 and there's 2022. But if you recall the international debate 2014, 2021, the amount of time you had to be asked, this is a civil war, are Ukraine and Russia the same language? Used to be part of the same state. It was so pervasive. And so Ukrainian agency was regularly put into question, dismissed. And this has radically changed in 2022. And I think that Ukraine has done an extraordinary job in terms of strategic communications, of sort of occupying that sort of shock that the international community faced in the face of the full-scale aggression, to reshape the discourse and capture the international attention to sort of speak up and sort of raise awareness about its history, its culture, its language. And I think that that is a very important point of no return that I think Ukraine has used wisely, and I think it will prove exceptionally important for future conversation about where Ukraine is heading, because its voice will not be put into question anymore.
Wonderful. We actually managed to end this part of the conversation on a slightly happy note. Thank you for that. I just want to thank the online audience for following us. We have been streaming this event, but we'll cut the stream now and move on to questions.